We're going to be starting our next panel, Living on Dry Land, starting with a lecture by Charles Hayek, a Lebanese history instructor and cultural heritage consultant who's here with us from Beirut today. Charles will be discussing the history of agriculture in the Middle East and the Arab world, focusing on the Abbasid Agricultural Revolution that shaped medieval food production, Arab botanical manuals, and culinary heritage. This will be followed with a discussion and Q&A led by Noor Razian, head of exhibitions at Arjamil. And then an artist talk and conversation with Moza Al-Matrushi and Rahul Kodipudi. Moza and Rahul will be discussing her new film and the production of her new film, There is an Edible Gold, which was commissioned for the exhibition staple What's on Your Plate, curated by Rahul, exhibitions curator at Arjamil, and Danny Burrows, who works with a curator at Delfina Foundation. So yes, thank you.
You will forgive me for starting with a question. I'm a teacher, and it is slightly difficult to escape this destiny. What is the dominant color in Arabic flags, in the flags of the present-day Arabic countries? Where's the green? Yes, of course. However, if we think a bit, yellow is the dominant color if we speak of the natural features that are dominant in the Arab world, the desert. So why yellow didn't make it into Arabic flags? It did actually. There is some yellow in the flag of Mauritania and the Comoros Islands, but however, it's not there. There's green. Why? This is an interesting question that we have to address to understand the cultural heritage of the Arabs. Given that the desert is yellow and that it is the dominant feature in the Arab world, naturally speaking, one expects to find it as the dominant color in the flags. However, if it is not, this color is absent and green is there. So why didn't the Arabs reflect this color that is around them in their flags? For a simple reason. They saw the desert as green, and they never saw it as an empty space. This idea that the desert is hostile to agriculture, to civilization, to life, is foreign, is completely alien to our area. Why? This is a short historical overview of how this area, the Middle East, the Arab countries, witnessed two major events, two major historical events that shaped the destiny of humanity. The first event happened when there were no Arabs yet, well, no ethnic conscience. It's before the birth of civilization and countries. We call it the Neolithic Revolution. The second was actually brought to the scene mainly by the Arabs in a period that is known as the Golden Age of Islam, the Abbasid Empire, and it's called the Arabic Agricultural Revolution. So the common narrative that completely disassociates the five main themes that I will be covering today, the idea, the discourse that divides agriculture and disassociates agriculture from the Arab lands is something that was developed in the 18th century and 19th century and early 20th century by a school of thought that we call Orientalism. This school of thought said that given that the Arabs are originally nomads and they come from a desert, they are hostile to agriculture. And given that in the 7th century they came to control the vast stretch of land between Spain and Central Asia, agriculture regressed. This was the dominant scholarly theme of the studies up until the 70s, when new textual and archaeological evidence started telling us a different story, a story that what happened actually is exactly the contrary. Not only agriculture did not regress, but it expanded. Let's start with the first. So this is where this narrative is, and this narrative, as you know, was heavily used by colonialism, because colonialism justified its civilizational mission by reintroducing agriculture into the Middle East, and sometimes by destroying native indigenous techniques and crops and seeds and replacing them by imported plants and cash crops that completely changed the economy and society. And the modern history of Lebanon, especially in the last 10 years of Ottoman rule and during World War I, is the perfect example of how the cash crop, it was silk, and to produce silk you needed mulberry, destroyed the age-old cereal production in Mount Lebanon and led to a massive famine that killed almost 40% of the inhabitants of this area. Let's go back to a much lighter story, the beginnings of agriculture. So not only this narrative says that the Middle East and the Arab countries have nothing to do with agriculture, it completely forgets that one of the founding events in human history, the Neolithic Revolution, happened in the Middle East. You know, historians love to coin weird terms to describe historical periods. Neolithic is a rather very large and important period of prehistoric times. It comes from the Greek neos, new, and lithos, stone, because our ancestors upgraded their technology. Technology back then was all about using stones to produce tools, and to produce tools to practice agriculture. So this is why we name this period that started 12,000 years ago as the Neolithic Revolution. It witnessed something that is very important, the beginning of agriculture. Following a period of climate change, we think that this is the end of one of the many ice ages that this area witnessed. Our ancestors had to adapt to a new environment. They had challenges. Before the discovery of agriculture, humanity depended on what we call, they were hunter-gatherers. They were hunting for prey and gathering fruits and vegetables. So now, 12,000 years ago, they have less greenery, less prey, less trees. So they needed to find a new way to produce food and to sustain themselves. They had already understood the value of some form of cereals. We know, if you are familiar with Middle Eastern cuisine, we have something called lifrike or lifrik. It is green wheat. This is one of the oldest processed foods in the history of mankind, because in some archaeological sites in Syria, Palestine, Iraq, southern Turkey, we found that even before they started practicing agriculture, they were already grilling the wheat and taking them as kind of a snack or superfood on their long, long journey to hunt. So they already knew the benefits of certain crops and certain plants. And we know that it took them thousands of years to understand the concepts of the different climatic conditions, how to use irrigation, when to plant, and eventually, at the end of this period, humanity already had agriculture. And this happened in the Middle East. This completely changed the way we live, because now, for the first time, we control our food source. And we try to control our food source. And in doing so, in this area, and new scholarship and archaeology is actually proposing a bigger map where we include the Arabian Peninsula into this Neolithic revolution. The green dots are sites in Arabia where we have this kind of early form of either agriculture or domestication of animals that later on would be very important in the economic system. So this is very important to keep in mind. It started here. And also, I don't know if you have ever been to Al Ain. It's a very important archaeological site, and the ongoing excavation are documenting one of the consequences of this agricultural revolution, the birth of the first villages. And with the birth of the first villages, you have all the crafts needed to preserve food. So now humans started to produce clay pots. It's the ancestor of the Tupperwares, of plastic. Imagine that. To understand how important clay is, all you have to do when you go back home is remove everything that you have that is made of plastic or glass. And this is why, for archaeologists, clay is way more important than gold to sequence and date and understand a site. Also, this is the period when the first elements of religion emerged. We know, like what we find in Al Ain or other parts of Arabia or the Levant or Bilad al-Sham or Turkey, we have a sense of spirituality that is emerging. How do we know that? We know that now they are building monuments in their settlements that are slightly better maintained. They are either made of stone with some beautiful carvings, or they are scale-wise huge, and we find offerings there. And what kind of offerings? Products of their agriculture. We find cereals, we find dates, we find grapes, we find bones of domesticated animals. So this is a period of major change. If we continue this overview of this period, we can trace the domestication of 8 crops that some scholars coin as the founder crops. Why are they so important? So if we see the flax, the bitter vetch, the chickpea, the peas, the lentils, the barley, the wheat, the two types of wheat, these are crops that are still foundational in the food systems, either the local food system or the global food system. They were first domesticated in the Middle East. Well, are they native to the Middle East or not? This is something that is rather difficult to coin, because as you explained, this is the entire theory of movement of plants. But archaeology shows that this is one of the regions when we had for the first time the mass production of these crops. So flax, which is very important because, you know, why do we use flax especially? To produce what? One of the reasons, I'll give you the answer at the end, to be a very mean teacher. The bitter veg, kersenna in Arabic. This is something that slightly disappeared from our food system. Chickpea, the hummus, even if it is an auxiliary recipe in Arabic food, this is not a main recipe, and we will be talking about that. It is important and it is key to the food systems, and it has been identified in all the major archaeological sites in the what we call the Fertile Crescent. Pea is very important also to the food systems in this area. Lentils, adas, also very important. And barley, you know, we used to have bread made out of barley. Bread was not exclusively made from wheat, it was also made from barley. So the idea was to diversify the sources of food, the emmer wheat, and this is something important to keep in mind, that the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon was one of the key regions of the Neolithic revolution that witnessed the emergence of agriculture. So why am I talking about that? If you go to history books, and history books that are rather Eurocentric or are produced to reflect the dominant narrative, this Neolithic revolution is mentioned slightly without an emphasis on this area. There is another event that also shaped the agriculture and the food system, the global food systems, what we call the Arab Agricultural Revolution. So with the advent of Islam in the early 7th century, not only a new religion grew out from Arabia, but also a new geopolitical force. Let me show you what do I mean by geopolitical force. So if you are familiar with some basics in Islamic history, you do know that following a period of massive change in the Middle East in the early 7th century, the two ex-superpowers, the Eastern Roman Empire and the Sasanian Iranian Empire, engage in what we would call an early type of global war, of world war. This also was coupled with climatic change and with a plague, the Justinian plague, that almost wiped out 30% of the population. However, one region was left out of the conflict and of the effect of the plague, Arabia. And this is where we can situate the emergence of Islam in a historical context. In a series of wars, and especially the Battle of Yarmouk and the Battle of Qadisiyah, these Arabs, unified under this new religion, defeated the ex-global empires and conquered in a rather short span of time an immense territory. Not only an immense territory, but let's put this territory in context. You have the great agricultural plains in Mesopotamia and Syria and Lebanon. You have a very urban also region. You have Egypt, you have Tunis and Algeria, very important areas in agriculture under Roman times. This is where olive oil in the Roman Empire mainly came from, and also Spain. This is something very important to keep in mind, because usually this narrative, whenever it speaks about Islam, and I'll go to a classical Hollywoodian image, they always talk about the desert. They forget that the classical Islamic civilization is urban. This is a civilization of cities, of very important cities situated on global trade routes. Cities that not only were centers of knowledge and production of science, but cities that needed to be fed. This is an empire that had high-density cities, but also high-density rural areas. So you have a challenge, how to feed your people. This led, and what I'm talking about is a process. This is not something that happened in a year. The process led first the new authorities, let's say, to adopt local skills that are related to agriculture. Either Arabic skills that were developed in Arabia, or, and this is mentioned in the agricultural and botanical manuals that were produced in the 8th and 9th century as زراعة النبطية النبطية. We tend to misunderstand the term nabat in Arabic. Nabat in Arabic means native, indigenous. So they adopted something that was already there. And also, because there was a massive interest, this is an empire of curious minds. There was a massive movement of translation of earlier agricultural manuals developed either by the Greeks, the Romans, the Persians, the Indians, and this led to what we call the Arabic Agricultural Revolution. So what is this revolution and why is it a revolution? This revolution is based on two major aspects: mass production to sustain the population, and we'll see mass production of what, and also this mass production is coupled with a scientific production of manuals. And here there's something very interesting. We have two levels of manuals. Either the, what we would call today, how to be a farmer in 10 days manuals that were circulating in this empire. Keep in mind, this empire, even if later it was fragmented politically, it had a cultural unity. It had one high culture. Classical Arabic was taught everywhere. So the manuals could circulate easily. And this is a key element whenever you want to ensure that an idea would move from one place to another. And the more advanced manuals that I've mentioned somewhere, I'll go back to them. So this revolution had far-reaching consequences, affecting not only the actual agricultural techniques, but also population levels. You have a well-fed population, a better-fed population. You had urban growth. You have also a new distribution of a kind of specialized labor force. You had linked industries. I'll give you an example that is not well known. You know where is Khorasan? Khorasan would be now between Turkmenistan and Iran. This is a very dry area. Under the Abbasid Empire, this was one of the major cotton-producing areas in the world. How did they grow cotton in a semi-arid land? Well, you needed science to properly construct irrigation systems and understand what kind of native types of cotton to plant to be able to produce. Why am I talking about cotton? Because this revolution was not only about food and agriculture, it was about what we are wearing also. Cotton, which was developed earlier in India, was transformed by this new Arabo-Islamic empire into something that is rather common and accessible for everyone. These are key elements to keep in mind while rediscovering this revolution from the golden age of Islam, and how this prosperity that enabled Baghdad, Al-Mosul, later on Al-Qahira to become global cities based on a highly productive agriculture. This is one of the what is beautiful for historians and for art historians, that we still have the manuals, and these manuals are decorated with exquisite miniatures. What do you see here? So we see someone who is actually sitting under a tree and producing some kind of juice. Why this is important? This is important first because it gives us an idea about what trees they were planting, how they were planting, and it gives us also another dimension, some ideas about the costumes and the fashion that was prevalent in this period. The crops that were, this is the map of Al-Idrisi, so the world was not upside down, but the idea to point everything to the north is rather a recent idea from the 19th century. So maps that were produced in the Islamic empires were usually pointed or directed towards the Qibla, towards Mecca. So this is why you have what now we call upside down maps. So the idea was that during this period, 17 food crops and 1 fiber crops became important over a large area of the Mediterranean, Mesopotamia, during the first 4 centuries of Muslim rule, and were introduced during this agricultural revolution. Some of them are still key to the global food system. I'm talking about rice, sugar cane, banana, lemon, lime, durum wheat, and sorghum. Can you imagine now the current global food system without sugar? Sugar was one of the main products of the Abbasid Empire. And sugar was one of the main also producers of wealth. And now there are some studies that there is some kind, even if we are using the word with a lot of caution, some kind of early form of industrialization. Because to produce sugar, you need a factory, and you need an extremely well-organized labor force that resembles how modern factories work. This also, we can add watermelon, the famous batinjane, eggplant, spinach, artichoke, sour orange, mango, and this is one of the beautiful depictions of agricultural activity in one of these manuals. So this golden age, this revolution, and I need to highlight that this was actually coined by Andrew Watson. The late Andrew Watson is an important historian of agriculture and agrarian studies. When he presented his paper, and the Arab Agricultural Revolution and its diffusion, 700, 1000 AD, in 1974, no one took him seriously. They thought that what he's saying, this is nonsense, this is an area that is mostly desert, how can it be the center of an agricultural revolution? However, now, we are finding that the theoretical framework that he presented in 1974 is actually reflected in the archaeological evidence that we have, and we are slowly going back to what the idea he presented as the Arabic agricultural revolution. So it was based on irrigation, high productivity agriculture, and long distance trade. When the Arabs controlled this vast area, one of the first things they did was either restore older irrigation systems or expanded them. And this is key because you needed to, in an area that is dry, to understand how and when to collect water. In Arabia, for example, you have the famous al-qanawat, underground systems that you find in Iran, you even find in Syria and Lebanon, and that are essential to how water was extracted and used. High urbanization rates, we're talking about cities with 500,000 inhabitants. Can you imagine that? Back then, this is huge. We are also, because they needed this specialized labor, so they needed to pay them more to be able to work. So we have, because we actually have documents about salaries, we have evidence of higher salaries that were paid for these, for the skilled labor. And high wages would also create a demand for high-income goods and new tastes and luxuries. So the items that we usually associate with high Islamic culture or Islamic architecture and design, the lamps, the brass, these were luxury goods that were demanded on the market. Of course, we have the movement of plants, new plants, food plants, specialization in manufacturing, literacy, because you needed to read the manuals to understand how to properly produce. The spread of the use of paper, taken from the Chinese and transformed into a major production, especially in Al-Basra. And in the old cities, you even had entire neighborhoods called Hayy al-Warraqin, waraq, the papers. And technical innovations, shipbuilding, textile, chemicals, an entire movement that is out of the narrative. This is one of the representations of Abbasid elites eating. I'm going back to this. Elements of the Arabic agricultural revolution and plants would eventually be key in what we call the Colombian Exchange. This is when the Europeans in the 15th and late 15th and early 16th century discovered and conquered the New World, took products that were around the Mediterranean and Arab lands and planted them in the new lands they conquered. And this is key to understand that knowledge, skill, and products that were developed in the Arab lands became key in this Colombian exchange. And one of the last elements that was developed later on, not in the Abbasid period, was coffee. From Yemen to Mecca Bilad Sham, to Istanbul, to Vienna, to the New World. I don't think we can imagine our lives without coffee. Also, what's very important is that this new culture, a new agricultural knowledge found its way into teaching in the madrasas. You had scholars teaching agriculture, and we have 3 manuals from this period that are key to anyone who is interested in rediscovering this largely unknown heritage. You have Kitab al-Nabat, a treatise on plants by Abu Hanifa Dinawari. We are in the 9th century CE. Kitab al-Filaha al-Nabatiyya, book on indigenous agriculture. So they went and documented the skills that, imagine that we think that we are pioneers, but they were actually going and asking the peasants how they were doing their skills, and they documented that in books by the great Ibn Wahshiyya. We cannot understand agriculture in dry land without Ibn Wahshiyya. And Kitab al-Saydala, because these plants also had pharmaceutical dimensions, they were trying to produce medicine and understand these plants in this medical context. Kitab al-Saydala, Pharmaceutical Encyclopedia by al-Biruni. Also, what's rather lovely is that these food crops found their way into the culinary heritage of this area. We are talking about a curious civilization, and also we are talking about an extremely curious palate. Who here would like to try a recipe from 10th century Baghdad? Any volunteer? Let me introduce you to a great work made by the great Iraqi scholar Nawal Nasrallah. We owe her a lot in this field because she was one of the first local Arab scholars to go and document the food of this area historically, because globally, I know this would sound, this is not nice, but usually hummus and falafel are auxiliary, secondary recipes in the culinary heritage. They are neither sophisticated or complex. So the real culinary heritage of the Arab world is out of the narrative, it's largely unknown. And when we go and read one of the earliest cookbooks in the Arab world called Kitab al-Tabikh, a very simple title, by a guy called Ibn al-Sayyar al-Warraq. He is a son of a paper producer. He documented food in 10th century Baghdad. We have the manuscript. Nawal Nasrallah analyzed the manuscript, translated the recipes. I'll give you 2 recipes. So first, why these books are important. We're not only talking about the passionate and nice recreation of historical recipes. These are recipes that we should analyze anthropologically, socially. First, we have in details what they are using. So we have the effects of this agricultural revolution on their food. We have the techniques. We even have the names of the pots. And we also have a key element. It reflects not only this sophisticated high culture that is interconnected. They are trying foods from India, from Persia, from Europe, from China, and creating something new. It is also inclusive. This book has an entire chapter. I'll read the title in Arabic and English. ما يأكل النصارى من الطعام في الصيام. Simulated dishes which Christians eat during Lent. We have an entire section that is dedicated to food that is special for it. You know, in Christianity, you are not supposed to consume anything. You are actually asked to become a vegan for 40 days. So this is a book written by a Muslim scholar. However, it has a chapter. Why? Because these cities were diverse. And you had large communities of Arab Christians living in this Islamic empire and integrated. Not only he mentions the recipe, but also there is a section of the book where you have some general knowledge about a healthy diet. We think we are pioneers. Well, it starts with إصلاح في التغذية, reform in the way you, and he is, I think he has a slight vegetarian leaning. This is one of the recipes has truffles. Usually we associate truffles with European cuisine. However, this was key in I'll give you a simple recipe called al-barida. You know, usually we say meza. Well, the actual name is bawarid, barida. It's cold food. A recipe for a cold dish of beans, baridat al-lubya. Boil the beans and press out their moisture. Put them in a bowl and pour mustard on them and equal amounts of vinegar and sweet olive oil. Sprinkle a generous amount of walnut and garnish it with chopped parsley and serve it, God willing. It's a simple recipe. However, there are some elements that are completely alien to our food palate. There is something that was heavily used called al-murri. This is a sauce that is very similar to oyster sauce. The taste, I mean. This disappeared from the region. There are recipes of muhallabiya. You've tasted muhallabiya? It's made with milk. However, it has chicken here. It survived in Istanbul. It's called kazandibe. I'll give you another recipe, if you allow me. A recipe of crepe. Usually also crepe are considered to be quintessentially European, but we have here a recipe for pretty, it's called zarifa, zarif, pretty qatayif. The qatayif are our local crepes by Ibrahim bin al-Mahdi. So you know who is Ibrahim bin al-Mahdi? So someone very important in the Abbasid dynasty. Choose the tender innermost of the fresh jumar. You know what is the jumar? I read. The jumar is the sprouting leaves of the date palm that appears at the very top of the tree. So climb the jumar, unless you don't fall, for it tastes exactly like newly dried walnuts. Finally chop it along with skinned fresh walnuts, mix the two, add a similar amount of crushed tabarzad. Tabarzad is white cane sugar. This was very expensive. Mix and them with rose water and a little oil of almond and walnut and cook the qatayif. So this is very important to understand how this food reconstruct our social, economic, and agrarian history. Kitab al-Tabikh. We have, this is, there is what would be an early comic book in the Abbasid Empire called Maqamat al-Hariri. Maqamat are short stories. This would be the Netflix of the 9th century. And these short stories, usually they came in rather big books with miniatures. And you can see people in Baghdad in the 10th century eating and enjoying a feast. They are very important. And some of the recipes we know were apparently personal delicacies of Abbasid caliphs like al-Mutawakkil, al-Mahdi, or their wives. You've all tasted something made out of eggplants in the Arab world, either mutabbal or batinjan bathini. The original name was Buraniye, and Buran is the wife of Harun al-Rashid. Haruniya, Ma'muniya, Mutawakkiliya, Ibrahimiya. So food was named because it was one of the favorite dishes by the caliph. And so this is a PR strategy. If it is eaten in the palace, everyone will eat it. And so this reflects how complex and sophisticated this cuisine was. And so why don't we know of this? Why this discourse is completely absent? First, there is a Jordanian scholar who happens to be my teacher also at the AUB, Dr. Tariq Tel. He introduced a new theory to understand how this area, how the dynamics of this area work. Because usually this narrative says that it's desert, there's nothing. he introduced a more complex understanding of the three life, let's say, spaces in the Middle East: the Badia, the Reef, and the Medina, the city, the rural areas, and the nomadic culture, and how they were profoundly integrated, especially in food production. You know that usually the Bedouins were the main suppliers of not only meat to the cities, but they would also be because they move, they would carry trade with them. They would carry also knowledge and skill. They would also be the ones who would give the wool to produce clothing. And so this integrated area was kind of completely dislocated in the early 20th century with the birth of the nation states in the Middle East, especially in the area of the Fertile Crescent, when this disrupted these dynamics that were here for centuries. So the discourse of the age of colonialism was needed, as I said, to justify what was portrayed as a civilizational mission, bringing back agriculture to a dry land. It was also used, and still is used, to justify conquest, dispossession, and replacement of native crops that are better adapted to a dry land with cash crops that were key to the colonial economies, and such as the mulberry trees to produce silk in Lebanon, or the grape in Algeria, etc. We are currently witnessing a shift in the scholarship towards a better understanding of agriculture in an arid and semi-arid zone, taking into consideration what Dr. Tell describes as the three living spaces of the Middle East: the cities, the Fallah, and the Badu, and how agriculture historically was at the heart of the Middle East, practiced, even if Orientalists didn't see it, from under a tent. You could easily farm the desert. You don't need a sedentary life to be a farmer. So the misconception was that, to farm the land, you needed settled cities. Well, we have now new evidence from Arabia, from Jordan, from the UAE, from Oman, from KSA, of large farming community, but they were farming the land from their tents. Also, and this is very, very important, it is key in times of changing, in times where we are challenged in food sovereignty, to go back to this, to rediscover first for the pleasure of rediscovery, and to understand how important it is to know that we have green roots. We have been practicing agriculture for almost 20,000 years, as you said. So we are not new in the field. And last, I would like to conclude, because you know how important poetry is in our culture. I'm not a poet. I'm a horrible poetry writer. However, not only this Arabic agricultural revolution was reflected in economy, in urbanism, in science, in the production of manual, it was also reflected in art. And there was a type of poetry in the Abbasid Empire called Qasaid al-Riyad. These were poems written for their gardens. Why? Because if you are someone who is rather wealthy in this period, you would actually create your own garden in the desert. You are reflecting, you are actually bringing life to the desert, and you would transform this area into a place of leisure and poetry. And Qasaid al-Riyad, we have one by the very famous, no need to introduce him in depth, Abu Nawas, who said, if he is a classical Arabic poet, on the day he fell short, he found his bliss in the shade of green gardens. And if the wind breezes through a meadow, it does to dispense upon you musk and amber. Let's go back to our green roots and let's start rediscovering this beautiful, beautiful story. Thank you.